So, welcome everybody. Welcome to our conversation with Bishop Anne Hodges-Copple of North Carolina. I'm Lallie Lloyd, and I'm going to open us with a word of prayer. So please join me. God of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we call to mind your presence within us and around us. Open our ears that we may hear your word. Open our hearts that we may understand your word. Open our mouths that we may speak your word. Inspire us with the gospel message that we may celebrate all that is life-giving, restore hope where it has been lost, and work to bring about change where it is needed. May we live the gospel with courage, constancy, and love. May we be open to the challenge of your call to true freedom. May we be faithful to you in our daily choices and decisions. May we make your love known through our words and actions. May God reign in our hearts now and forever. Amen. So our dialogue partner is Bishop Anne Hodges-Copple, serving as the suffragan, which is the Episcopal Speak for Assistant Bishop of North Carolina since 2013. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your diocese is the middle third of the state of North Carolina, so that includes the cities of Charlotte and Winston-Salem, Raleigh-Durham, the Research Triangle, and Rocky Mount. Is that right? And how have you all been affected by Hurricane Florence? Is everyone okay?
Well, we have come off relatively unscathed with minimal, some damage and disruption, and there's a lot of cleanup. But compared to, it was other parts of our state that were more heavily hit. And so while we have some relief about what we were spared, we have great grief as well as concern, and now coordination and collaboration with East Carolina and South Carolina. So we're now fully engaged in the recovery effort, though we're in a position to do what we can because we were relatively spared the immediate and direct effects of the hurricane.
Good. Well, I'm glad. Thank God for that, right?
Yes, indeed.
So we're going to be talking today about what's going on in your diocese around education equity. But first, let's just pause and clarify like what we're talking about in that concept. Within all our children, when we use that phrase, what we mean by equity is every child getting what they need to thrive, to be able to be self-sufficient financially as an adult, to be able to support a family if that's their choice, to have a career that allows them to grow and to contribute to their communities in ways appropriate to their gifts and their interests. So what would you add to that concept of education equity from your own experience and from what you know is going on in your communities?
Well, and the other thing I would add is that I think that for a lot of us, it's been evolving to understand that there's a difference between equity and equality and opportunity. They're all related. And I think an exciting thing that's happening and greatly connected to our increasing role with schools is that it's not enough to have things equal. It's not enough to have just access. Equity is a far more lean in kind of goal that, just as you expressed, has to do with taking into account certain historical factors, certain facts on the ground conditions that mean that to make all God's children be able to fulfill all the possibility they're imbued with, we have to look at each situation and each context with a certain amount of sensitivity. So I think equity is a really exciting concept, but one that we're still having to do a lot of work around. When we're taking that baptismal covenant a little, we're not just respecting. If we're respecting the dignity of all human beings, we have to be protecting that dignity. And then we have to see what threatens that dignity. And equity is such an engaging concept of saying, then we may have to transform some context and some circumstances if children are going to be able to achieve all the potential of their gifts.
Right. So being concrete and explicit about that, I know, my children were able to go to quality preschool programs, and we live in a literacy-rich home with lots of, with job and income and food stability. And that is not the case for many of our most vulnerable children. So equity, the implication, I think, of what you're saying, which we support completely and agree with, of course, is that investing in early childhood programs and parent support programs and job and housing and food stability is all the long-term investment in children's well-being that bears fruit in their education opportunities.
And by highly contextualizing it is why we have programs in North Carolina especially designed for children whose first language is not English.
Right.
So while you might have equal access to a public kindergarten, if you haven't had opportunities in early childhood education or based on the context of your home life, then you're not going to be in the same position starting kindergarten. So what we know is all children don't start kindergarten in the same place.
Right.
But not all preschools can address those issues. So our Los Escuelitas are excellent at taking children and their families where they are. Those are primarily Spanish-speaking households, and making sure things are taught in a way that gives those children the best chance to be kindergarten ready when they hit their neighborhood public schools. There's some equity in that to design a different kind of program for Spanish-speaking households.
I look forward to talking about that some more. But first, let's go back, and I would love to hear some of your own personal formation experiences of what drew you to work for education equity out of your own life experience.
I grew up in a downtown Dallas Episcopal church, lifelong Episcopalian, in a church of considerable resources, all kinds of resources, financial, educational, cultural resources. But interestingly, our church, our nearby neighbors, particularly the children who lived nearest to this very affluent church, lived in housing projects. And it was my downtown church, Church of the Incarnation, and somewhat coming out of the civil rights movement that began in the 60s and 70s, wraparound programs for those children. So my church did tutoring programs during the school year and empowered high school students like myself in more affluent parts of Dallas to be the coaches, the tutors, the mentors for children from the projects, which were primarily African American and Chicano, Latin American. In the summer, we had enrichment camps where these same children could continue to work on their literacy skills, but also learn to swim. If we had arts, we took them to all the free museums. But so in highly segregated Dallas, my church brought together different communities. The camp counselors in Project Operation Life Encounter, which is Olay, it brought together teenagers as the camp counselors from different parts of Dallas, all to focus on children. That all these were our children. I mean, so we had this formation in our church I watched the older teenagers do this. You wanted to do this program. So my church was instilling in me an opportunity for engagement, empowerment, solidarity. We may not have used those words, and that those were deeply knit into being the body of Christ. And to do that in very conservative Dallas, Texas, in the name of Jesus, has shaped me and my understanding of the gospel ever after.
Wow. I know that you spent some time as a community organizer in your early adult years. You were both in Massachusetts and in Appalachia, I understand it, and a lot of your work there was with women who were victims of domestic abuse. I'm wondering whether your experience as an organizer, with the particular skills that organizers focus on, has that, it sounds like this program, this Olay program, in some ways knew some of that. It's highly relational, right? It was building leadership skills on the part of the young adults, you as a teenager. Is there a connection in your experience to your organizing, your life as an organizer?
Yes. Yes, and let me tell you this in a biblical story that I think the first chapter of Exodus is the beginning of the liberation of the slaves in Egypt, the Hebrew slaves, and the first actors of liberation are the midwives, right? Sipra and Pua and the Hebrew were the community organizers of organized resistance, political, economic, physical resistance to a power structure that was literally going to kill children. You know, it is deeply in our biblical DNA to look at and protect and liberate children in a way that set them free in all sorts of ways. But it's organizing, right? Those Hebrew midwives stood alongside the people of Israel. They were not a power down structure. They were alongside. I think community organizing is that kind of walking with. I mean, Jesus walked with the people of the Galilee. So organizing does break it down into a lot of different kind of skills, but you can use community organizing skills for evil things as well as for good things. There's a lot of tools, but what has to undergird that, I think, is your purposeful mission. And Scripture has always told that we look at the least and the most vulnerable, which the children being the primary example of that. So yes, whether it was I was the director of a battered women's shelter. I organized about lead paint poisoning in Chelsea in Massachusetts. I did a lot of work in Appalachia, but all of that had to do with accompaniment and a belief that the people you walk with have the skills within them to achieve potential, but that we can walk in ways that resist a power structure that would try to undermine human freedom and human potential. But you do that in community. If you're not having those biblical imperatives interlocked with the skills of organizing, I think it's easy to get off track.
That's a really helpful connection that I hadn't thought about, the ways in which community organizing can be used for unhealthy purposes in a community as well.
I won't get specific unless you ask me to, but we can go into history and see some amazing organizing examples that have not bettered the world particularly.
Yeah. Well, let's. I want to keep us focused here on our topic here this afternoon. So, say some more about how being a Christian informs your call and commitment to education equity. Clearly, it grew out of your own formation in a Christian community at home in Dallas. But as you've grown into your adulthood and into your leadership, can you say some more about the connections that you're seeing and your sense of call? And especially, I think, in your capacity now as suffragan bishop, sort of how that work is critical to the mission of the Diocese of North Carolina. So that's a nice big scope for you.
That's a big question.
Yeah, so you can reflect in that space.
One of the things I think is important to kind of reclaim, Jesus was a rabbi. He was a teacher. And the teacher was constantly, in a mission, not just of shaping up people who would obey the rules in a very narrowly constricted way. There's a way education can make individuals conform to a purpose of the empire. But in fact, Jesus as teacher was transforming his disciples to be transformative vessels back in their own communities, right? So the risen Christ at Easter says to his disciples, go back to Galilee, go back to those neighborhoods, those people, those neighbors you were told not to talk to or to ignore or see past, go back to those communities with the eyes of resurrection and new life. So there's something about the role of teaching and transformation of life. And so we see Jesus both in that teaching role, but also in that exemplar role in his resurrected life and that idea to go. So I think being part of the apostolic church, right, is that we're sent. We're by definition, if we're part of the apostolic, we're sent. So I think watching our churches, our parishes, our missions having an increasing sense of not just outreach in terms of charity, but being sent into the neighborhoods, into the schools, into the communities to again be vessels of transformation, in which the transformation is in all directions. So what we're seeing in our diocese and of course, Episcopalians have always been fabulous at early childhood education. I mean, that is in our deep DNA. We are educators, we are teachers, we have preschools galore. We probably, in much of the country, it was true what was true in North Carolina. Kindergarten started in churches, and eventually the public school system adapted that, right? So it is in our DNA to walk with parents and young children. But what we're now understanding is that it can't just be about our parochial definition of our children. It's the community's definition. So what I'm seeing in North Carolina as a diocese, we've created networks whereby I think churches are revisioning not only their own early childhood education programming and who has access to it, right? But also how to wrap around a neighborhood school more than, we have churches that do backpack buddies, backpacks filled with food for the weekend, but those backpacks are not a one-off because they're also part of an Augustine Literacy Project. The Augustine Literacy Project is something, if our listeners aren't aware of, is a fantastic literacy program that grew out of a local parish and now is at many of our parishes. It's a highly developed way of empowering our parishioners to go into the schools as tutors. But it's not just that. It's not just food. It's not just tutoring. It's also then getting to know the teachers and the principals and resourcing them as well as appreciating them and celebrating them. So our churches are understanding that this is our school, these are our students. And there's a real sense of wrapping services around that. Although that almost sounds too clinical when I say wrap around services. The Christian experience is always one of new creation. And what I'm seeing is churches experiencing a recreation of their relationships with neighborhood schools, especially churches that maybe don't have as many young children as they once had. And yet now they've said, oh, but we do. They're right here, right in our backyard, and they're ours. And that becomes life-giving to the church itself, as well as blessing the community.
So say some more about how those congregations are experiencing this life-giving dynamic, how they are benefiting as congregations from this relationship.
Well, one of the things that I think is a real blessing, but it's a painful one, is the way that, particularly in our majority white and privileged congregations, they are gaining hard, painful, but also important blessings around understanding structures of historic racism. How, the age-old question, why are people poor, can sometimes be answered in some very shallow and actually very inaccurate ways. So one of the blessings I'm seeing is as our parishioners, our members are becoming more engaged as schools, especially schools with a high percentage of minority students, they're having to do some homework about racial equity. And we now give thousands and thousands of scholarships for racial equity training that we ask people to do to improve and to enhance their commitment in all kinds of outreach, but especially working in minority majority schools. And then as people get that racial equity training, far from being anything that's shaming or debilitating, it is also empowering for the church members to understand their own history, our own complicity, but also the way that we are liberated from that in Jesus, and then empowered to love our neighbor in ways that have far more depth than we could have ever imagined. So, because all these issues are linked, right? Education with race, with gender, with economics, with ethnicity. And what I see is our church seeing the body of Christ much more vividly, with much more nuance and with much more appreciation.
I'm really moved by what you're describing, just because we so those are the conversations that are sometimes very challenging to have in congregations that are older and predominantly white. So I'm excited about that.
I think it's changed the nature of evangelism in our diocese. That what was once viewed as we are going to reach to them, the way that we're now more, it's like a big Venn diagram, the way that we're seeing all the ways that our communities overlap. There's a yearning to now share worship and to share fellowship and to share breaking of bread. So I think the sense of Eucharistic community is expanding as we partner with these schools. There's much more meal sharing that's going on between churches and schools, just breaking bread together. So there's a certain rich harvest inside of all of that.
Wow. Celebrate that, right? That's amazing. That's lovely. So what barriers are you are you and others, who are working alongside you in your diocese around this issue? What kinds of things are you bumping up against that are stumping you, or just are you encountering?
Right. Well, I have to be candid. One of the biggest obstacles, it seems to many of us in North Carolina, is the General Assembly, is the state legislature. And one of the obstacles, or one of the challenges once you have this kind of immersion in education, and certainly early childhood education, is you begin to see that equity has a lot to do with how teachers are paid, where we do have counselors, where we don't have counselors, where vouchers seem to work for the community or don't work. Allocation of resources becomes a big issue, and that is something where it feels as if our state legislature has not been as responsive as many of us would like to see it. Some pay increases have come in, but we're still not back to even 2008 levels of teacher compensation. And the achievement gaps in North Carolina, particularly around race and income, we're not closing those gaps. Disparities in discipline and what happens to Black students versus white students. So we as churches, communities of faith, want to be in partnership with the public policy makers. So it's meant that we are working in coalitions with other organizations to try to see some more transformative policies implemented at the statewide level.
Mm-hmm. So who are your partners in the diocese or across other groups at the diocesan and state level who are collaborating with you around these issues in terms of the General Assembly?
Here in North Carolina, we have for years now been very much a part of the Moral Mondays movement, which is a coalition of lots of faith-based organizations, labor organizations, and that is also now sort of evolved into the Poor People's Campaign led by the Reverend Barber. And so we have a lot of energy here in North Carolina around coalition building and trying to frame issues not in terms of Democrat or Republican, but in terms of priorities. So that we're not trying to be partisan about these issues, but we're trying to lay out who we think are the communities that need to have priority in the public policy. North Carolina Council of Churches is a huge partner for us on education issues, which overlap significantly with immigration reform. I would say, as the demographics of the school systems in North Carolina, the fastest growing demographic is Spanish speaking in every county in the public school system. So we're having to look at immigration issues, the Dreamers, DACA reform, all kinds of issues where immigration control enforcement, ICE, is involved in counties. We actually see that disrupting schools, making children afraid to go to school, making parents afraid to send their children to school. So we have a lot of things to talk to our state legislature about. And then at times there's times to talk to our senators about. And we do that respectfully and from a faith-based position, sometimes just as the diocese, but often in coalitions like the North Carolina Council of Churches, and others.
Wow.
North Carolina, we're kind of lucky, and this is not maybe, this is just my own, we've kind of had, you have the presiding Bishop Michael Curry, who has, just kind of this incredible Jesus love. You're kind of with, every day is Christmas with Bishop Curry. It's just you're overflowing with love. But you have this John the Baptist figure in Dr. Barber, who is also equally passionate and biblically based, but also has a certain level of, woe to you. Put a stumbling block in front of these my children, as Jesus said. So, we're not lacking for inspiration here in North Carolina, or vision. But what we are needing to do a lot is equipping ourselves to do this work well. And good hearts and good intentions are just not good enough.
So how are you going about doing that equipping? You mentioned supporting people to get race equity training. What other kinds of equipping of your local saints are you finding is helpful?
Well, one of the things that the diocese supports are these trainings and affiliates, or affiliates chapters of the Augustine Literacy Project. What we're doing is trying to link people with the skills they already have, or the interest they already have, and then make sure that they're putting them, they're getting the proper training so that they're doing the volunteer work that they're doing with some capacity, with some real, with some capacity to do that. I would say the other partnerships, or the other things that we're doing to kind of leverage this work, is that we've been very intentional with the various grant-making processes to try to streamline those grants, set priorities, around most vulnerable communities, most vulnerable populations, most vulnerable churches, communities of color, and then create collaboration. So we incentivize our churches to collaborate. Don't try to do this all by yourself with the grant-making progress. So I think a lot of it is just, and if we have a common app, right? We try to make sure that the churches who get all the money don't get it just because they're good at writing grants. We really try to take a proactive look at seeding and cultivating ministries where they're needed. And you kind of have to be prepared for things not to work at times, and then say, well, then what did we learn?
Well, if nothing ever doesn't work, then you're staying way far away from the edge of the risky, right? It's like, and if we want to see what's really growing at the edges, we have to be willing for some things to.
And let me circle back to one other thing, Lallie. One of the things that churches like to do, sort of our begetting sin, is we like to put our local stamp on something. This is a ministry of St. Luke's. This is a ministry of Christ Church. And one of the things we're trying to get people to do is to really understand, no, this is the Jesus movement. And therefore, ecumenism needs to be part of this. So we have a bilingual preschool in Durham that started out as a partnership of 3 Episcopal churches. Outstanding. Just to get 3 Episcopal churches to partner was really wonderful. But that is now an ecumenical ministry, right? It has. So we have to learn to be very adept at changing the formula so that we can keep bringing more partners to the table around how to do bilingual education, bring people from the University of North Carolina's School of Education. But that means churches have to give up a little bit of their power. And, that's a little hard to do sometimes. But I think that's been a capacity building lesson, is to work ecumenically, find your interfaith partners, and then go to the people who have the expertise to help you do what you want to do in its most effective way.
Yeah. I thank you for calling out how difficult it is to give up power. I think especially in congregations of people who are accustomed to having power and having social influence, that's sometimes one of our own obstacles to our own ongoing conversion, is an attitude, and I'm recognizing this in myself, so this is familiar to me, of feeling that that somehow this is ours, and we're gonna influence it, and we're gonna cultivate it, and we're gonna get the credit back to us. And I just really celebrate that that as those fingers of control can be released, just that releases energy. And I really celebrate and might borrow your encouragement to people to think of all of this as a local expression of the Jesus movement. And so it's a question of where else are we finding Jesus already at work in this, right? And how are we going to be able to collaborate? You know, Bono once said, "Don't ask Jesus to bless your work. Go where Jesus is already working," because that's that's where you're gonna find him. Yeah. And one of the things I love about the Augustine Project is that they ask for a really major commitment from their volunteers. As I recall, it's something like a 2-week summer training program, and they don't soft pedal that. They say, no, this is a really big commitment. This is really important.
Right.
And so they get people who are willing and who are actually looking and hungry for something really substantive to commit to. Yeah. So thanks for those.
It doesn't have to be the only way. We have a church in Burlington that's a huge Augustine Project component, but then they also have a reading buddies component.
Yeah.
So I love the idea that churches are going to look for ways that a lot of folks can plug in. Maybe I'm going to do backpacks, backpack buddies. Maybe I'm going to be a reading buddy. Maybe I'm going to be an Augustine tutor. And understanding that kind of comprehensiveness is part of what community is all about.
Yeah. Do you find that partnerships that start in those kinds of direct service relationships with the kids and even intensive tutoring relationships, do they inherently, is it your experience, do they inherently sort of evolve a core of advocates, of people who begin to look at like the 7 layers of why, like how did we get here and how are we going to get ourselves out of this, or do they tend to sort of stay in a worldview, if you will, or a model that's comfortable for them? I'm sure it's a little bit of both.
I think that varies. I really think that varies community to community. I certainly am aware of churches who've just kind of stayed. We found something that works and we're going to stay because it works for us. Right. And we kind of get to a certain level and then sort of are in a maintenance mode. And they're beautiful ministries and that's fine and good. But we are seeing partnerships that start with children and schools. We see this in St. Mark's, Huntersville, where the awareness of the congregation by working at Newland Elementary School has expanded to such a degree that it is a congregation of advocates around all education, but particularly inequality in education. And this is a church that's embraced racial equity training with a passion, and now is translating that into some advocacy at the county level. So yes, I definitely see. And of course it sparks some interesting conversations inside of congregations about parishes about, well, aren't we being political?
Right.
How to get through to the idea of, well, no, we're just being followers of Jesus. And again, something I said earlier, we may disagree on public policy and people can do that, but we have to have some agreement on the priorities, and especially the priority of quality of life for children and their families. And then we can be Republicans, we can be Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, but let's just agree on the priority at least. And then what comes out of that. So, but yes, we are starting to see more advocacy mostly by people who've gotten involved very much in their neighborhood schools.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn over now to Mary Liz Murray, All Our Children's Director of Communications and Programming, and see what questions, Mary Liz, you've gathered up from our participants and others.
Thanks. Most of you submitted questions ahead of time, which we love, and so we're going to get into some of those questions now. The first one I'm going to ask, I think Lallie and Bishop Anne, you'll both have things to say on this, but with slightly different lenses. So Bishop Anne, I'm going to go to you first. The question is, how can we encourage churches across the country to engage in these public-private partnerships? And so my question for you really is, what can you and other bishops be doing to be talking to each other so that this becomes a national priority for the national church? And Lallie, I think you might have some insight into the larger question of ecumenism and how we just build this movement nationally.
Well, I think the nice thing about, at least for the bishops, is we have some models to go on. We have a group of Bishops United Against Gun Violence. For example, our bishops work very hard on the Episcopal Public Policy Network to cover a range of issues. And many of our Episcopal churches, have their own schools. So I don't think it's not a hard sell. Education is already in the fabric of who we are. I think what is a little more difficult, because education works is raising education as a national, because it's such a state-oriented situation. And so I think some of the issues that we're going to have to really, so this is why I bring up immigration. I mean, I think immigration reform in some ways, particularly around DACA and around immigration enforcement, has huge impacts on all the children across the United States. And I think our bishops, as well as General Convention and churches, are trying to address that through the Episcopal Church Public Policy Network. But it's hard, it's sort of like trying to pull out threads in a tapestry. I think we see how interwoven all these issues are. So I kind of agree that it's a challenge to bring out the particular threads of early childhood education and all public education when it's such a very decentralized system. So I'm not sure I have any magic answers about how we inspire that, except I think this is what's going to come up from the grassroots. As I think this is fundamentally grassroots work. And then I think as bishops can lift up the stories that are happening at the grassroots, that is kind of what fuels that grassroots expansion. But it's a little harder, I think, to identify through the Episcopal Public Policy Network what we might advocate for at a national level when the issues are so state-oriented. Mm-hmm. Maybe why we need statewide public policy networks on our church.
Mm. So I would agree completely with what Bishop Anne just said. I think, and you've already shared stories with us about at the local level, at the grassroots level, how this work is ecumenical. You had a story about a coalition between an Episcopal and a Lutheran congregation, I think, and our neighborhoods, our local neighborhoods, are very religiously diverse. And I recommend that if someone is interested in doing this work locally, with an ecumenical lens, the best thing to do is to go make an appointment to go talk to the other pastors and ministers and ask them who in their congregation is already called to work on this issue. Teachers, grandparents, retired school staff. Our churches are full of people whose hearts are open to children at schools. I'm also active and connected with people at a national level who work across denominations and as part of different ecumenical religious networks who are focusing on education. So between those different conversations, I think those are the ways to keep the ecumenical passion for this in front of our eyes.
Bishop Anne, you've shared some great stories out of your diocese, and we had one question that asked specifically about churches working in the after-school environment. So I'm wondering if you have any knowledge of churches in your diocese working specifically after school, or that have an after-school or out-of-school time dimension to what they're doing with the schools.
Right. Well, one of the programs I encourage people to look up is the Latino Education Achievement Partnership, which is the partnership in Durham that works, not only does it have a preschool component, but it has an after-school component, both for elementary school age children as well as for middle school children. But it is in the evening. So if you're counting on things that work after school being also in the evenings, but it has an excellent record of recruiting volunteers from the universities, from schools who come in and do, it is some literacy work, but it's also some other enhanced scholarship work with children, and then some mentoring of middle school. So I encourage people to look up the Latino Education Achievement Partnership to see what an ecumenical group is doing to support children that start at very young and then walk them through to at least high school, so that you're working with the same families. That's the goal anyway. Those families do kind of come and go in some ways, but they have been and they measure the results of those. There's a lot of data keeping. So we want to be able to say, is this working? And we are really watching a closing of achievement gap for these are, again, from Spanish, where the home language is Spanish. We're seeing that make a tremendous difference in that program, but it meets in the evenings.
Great. I think AOC also knows of congregations working in the after-school environment, not necessarily in North Carolina, but in other places. Lallie, maybe you can talk a little bit about St. Stephen's after-school program and St. Andrew's after-school program.
Yes. So St. Stephen's in the south end of Boston began as a direct response to the felt needs of local parents who needed a place, this is more than a decade ago now, who needed a place for their children to do homework with safe supervision from adults. And at first, that's all it was. It was just a space with some adults to supervise. And over time, in a way that had echoes to me of Bishop Anne, your own story from when you were a young person in Texas, the program evolved to a place where the older children were providing the supervision and the staffing of the afternoon program, and then it even became a summer program where the older children were the camp counselors. So it was providing jobs for young people in a neighborhood where it was very difficult for these young people to have meaningful jobs with caring and mature adult supervisors. So what began as simply an after-school program, because that's what parents down the street asked for, has grown into a multi-dimensional, youth-centered program, and they now talk about their constituency as being young people from ages 5 to 25, which is really fabulous. St. Andrew's in New Bedford is on a very different scale. They provide after school 1 day a week, and that also emerged out of a sense of responding to the local needs of the children that they were actually meeting in their neighborhood. The form that takes, the congregation is close to the building, is close enough to the school that they can go to the school and walk the children down the street. And what they do on Friday afternoons is have supervised, structured but free play, so that the children can move among the different kinds of play stations, whether it's a dress-up corner or blocks or clay, so that they are self-selecting their own way of being quietly and engaged in very creative, informative play, the kind of play that many children don't have a lot of opportunity to participate anymore. So those are two very different examples of after-school programs that we know about.
Great, thanks. So one of the things we know about education equity is that it is not only an urban issue. Many people talk about, disadvantaged city schools, and I think it leaves a big part of the conversation out when it comes to rural schools. And I know that North Carolina is a place that is diverse in terms of having rural populations as well as urban centers. And so we have a question asking, if there are programs happening in both rural and urban areas, which of the programs you may have talked about already are in urban or rural settings, and how the approach might be different depending on which of those two types of places someone is in.
Well, I actually have two examples, and they're very, very, very interesting. I know we're getting close to our time, but I want to mention St. Mark's in Wilson, a very rural county, and St. Cyprian's in Oxford. Oh my gosh, what county is that? I'm going to be in trouble. Granville County. Very urban, rural areas where the economy has changed because of shifts in textile, especially tobacco and cotton and things. St. Mark's is a very small, historically African-American church, an older congregation, and those ladies organized an incredible after-school program for their neighborhood school. So even though it's a mission, it's a very small church, and it's a fairly elderly congregation, and it breathed so much new life into their congregation to reach out to the school, because the school now has a significantly high Latino population. And the same thing happened at St. Cyprian's in Oxford, a historically African-American church. Knowing the importance of education. Education is the one thing that cannot be taken from you. Saw that the children in their neighborhood who were not coming to their church were not getting everything they needed educationally. So they started an after-school program. So and diocesan dollars helped get those programs going. So I think, again, it's back to a point, I think every diocese needs to think very proactively about investing, not subsidizing, investing in rural churches who are reinventing themselves in terms of identifying with the children in their neighborhoods in ways that maybe seem different from their historical makeup, but are in fact the new present reality. And you don't have to have a lot of money. You don't have to be in a big old city to make this happen. And I think dioceses need to leverage that as much. So two great ones, St. Cyprian's and St. Mark's.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And our time is up for our online conversation. I invite everyone to join us online on our Facebook page to continue this conversation and keep this going. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter, you can do so at allourchildren.org, and that's always the best way to keep in touch and know about upcoming programs. So I think with that, we will end this public conversation. Thanks, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you, Lallie.
Thanks, Lallie. And there is just one more question that I'm going to make a small plug. We did have one question about resources for congregations who are motivated to get started with partnerships, and I'm going to point you to two All Our Children resources. Bishop Anne mentioned a lot of great local resources, including Augustine Literacy Project, that you can get involved with North Carolina. But we have a recording of our Roadmap to Partnership webinar up on our website now, and that's a great way to begin either individually or as a group at church. And we also have a book out, All Our Children, that can be purchased through church publishing or any other bookseller of your choice. And we have a free study guide available for that book, which is also a great place to start, especially with a small group at church. So thank you all for joining us. I just wanted to get those two in for that last question. And we are finished. Thank you.
Thanks.
So Bishop Anne, if you